Hey folks, 3,000 people ordered the Braveheart edition of the Pinephone, one of the first Linux phones. And many of these people will likely try out Ubuntu Touch, which is one of the running OSs available on the Pinephone. For Linux people, Ubuntu Touch seems like a locked up box, and this makes it very difficult to understand that deep down it's just a standard Linux device, but more locked down than a desktop Linux distro. In this video, I'll show you how to access all the files on Ubuntu Touch via Bash shell. I'll also show you some common commands you can use to do basic things on the shell, which is good if you know a little bit about using Linux on a command line. It's actually pretty simple. Sit tight and we'll get to it. You may be one of the new people who ordered a Pinephone and are new to Ubuntu Touch. Or you may already have Ubuntu Touch on an Android like a Nexus 5 or a OnePlus One. I'm certain that many in this group will already be familiar with Linux and likely use Linux on a desktop. So I'll be using some basic bash commands that should be familiar. And it's basic enough that a new person should be able to see what I'm doing. What I'll try to do in these series of videos is to remove the black box element of Ubuntu Touch so you can delve deep into what's in here. I wasn't successful at removing 100% of the mystery of how everything works, but I think I'm close. I've asked the wonderful people at Ubports for more information, so hopefully I myself will have more knowledge moving forward that I can share here. Whether or not you're an existing Ubuntu Touch user or a new user, you will likely feel more comfortable knowing how this phone works. The less of a mystery it is, the more we can feel that even bugs can be fixed if we find any in the future. In any case, at first glance, a new user to Ubuntu Touch expecting normal things to work out on it, just like a typical Linux distro, will find that it's pretty locked down. And you might get frustrated because you may have to wade through a lot of documentation to learn how to do simple things. Many of the specific features came from Canonical originally and purposely made to be different from the typical Linux distro. This video will remove that early difficulty immediately. You will be able to access the Ubuntu Bash shell or terminal, and I will also give you a basic idea of how the Ubuntu Touch file structure is different than your standard desktop distro. In this video, I'm going to be using a computer running Ubuntu 18.04. It shouldn't matter which distro you use. Also, the process should be quite similar on Windows and Mac. The first thing we have to do is run the Ubports installer. If you already installed Ubports installer on your computer in the past, then you don't have to repeat this step. And here's the funny part. We don't actually need Ubports installer at all. However, Ubports installer installs something that we need, which is ADB. ADB is the Android Debug Bridge program. This is used to access Android files from a computer. Well, it so happens that Ubuntu Touch can also run the ADB daemon on the phone, so the computer and the phone can talk to each other. And the fortunate part is that when you install the Ubports installer, it is automatically included. So I don't have to give different instructions for each platform. All the versions of Ubports installer are available on this GitHub link, which I will add to the description. And it's github.com/ubports/ubports installer/releases. So just install it and it should install ADB. So here I'm going to go through the process of installing it. Now when you look at the GitHub area for Ubports installer, you will see different versions of the installer for each platform. So you have the DMG for Mac, the EXE for Windows, and the one I'm going to be using on Ubuntu is the one that is a Debian package. On a Linux distro, you can call ADB from any directory, but on Windows, you will need to go to wherever you installed Ubports installer to find out where adb.exe is. So here we are, let's install Ubports installer. And that's it. Now let's go to the phone. Here I'm running Ubuntu Touch on a Nexus 5. I made another video in the past about how to install Ubuntu Touch on a OnePlus One, and there are notes there on how to install on a Nexus 5. I'll also be making a short video on how to make an SD card for the Pinephone. That's really easy, but I'm going to make a short video for you shortly. Now, by default, an Ubuntu Touch device will not support ADB, but it will if you enable developer mode. So again, to repeat this, when you enable developer mode on the phone, the ADB daemon starts and your computer using ADB can talk to the phone. Here's how you enable developer mode. First, you go to Settings. Then you scroll down to the very bottom and look for About. Then click on it. Then on the About screen, scroll past the displayed area and you will see an option for developer mode. Developer mode will not be available until you specify a lock security. So in this case, I'll just set up a temporary 4-digit passcode. You'll have to confirm the passcode, and then now you will see that the developer mode button can be activated. The moment developer mode is active, the ADB daemon is started and it is ready to talk to your computer. The next step is to connect your phone to the computer using the correct cable. So here I have a Nexus 5 and here is a USB cable. In order for ADB to work, you must use a USB cable capable of USB 2. And the way you know this is by the color of the end there. Look at this micro USB cable that I'm using. So the thing that identifies it is the color. So USB 2.0 has a black colored connector. USB 1 has a white colored connector, and USB 3 has a blue colored connector. So if the phone supports USB 2.0, then use the black colored cable. If in the future a phone supports USB 3, then you can get one with the blue connector. At the moment, none of the phones that work with Ubuntu Touch uses USB 3, so just find one with a black cable. By the way, the USB connectors that are white, you may have one of those, are good for charging. However, they will not support ADB, so don't make that mistake. Now plug in your phone to the computer using the USB cable, and then while the phone is in developer mode, run this command on your computer. ADB devices. This will automatically start up ADB if it's not active before. If there's a connection, the identifier of the phone should appear. Otherwise, you're not connected. Either you're not in developer mode, or you're using the wrong cable, or you're not logged into the phone. The next command is ADB shell. Now you're in, and you can do the typical things you can do on a Linux distro. So let's just scan through the file structure. The default user on Ubuntu Touch is called Phablet. And also by default, you are in the home Phablet directory, and you can see your documents, your pictures, downloads, videos, music, and so on. The easiest way to move files from your computer to the phone and vice versa is by using the file manager on your computer. On my file manager in Ubuntu, while the USB is plugged in, I can see files on the Nexus 5. Now, the only limitation here is that you can only see the files in home Phablet directory. You can also transfer files back and forth using a command line. But in reality, due to having to constantly change permissions, it's faster to just move files to the home folder if you want to move it in and out. Better for security and less chances of messing things up. You have to be logged into the phone with a passcode before the file manager will show you the file. So if you don't see anything, that's the reason. The command line approach is by using the ADB pull and ADB push command. This is more handy when scripting a file transfer, for example. To move a file from your computer to the phone, the command is ADB push. So here I do ADB push and then the source file and then the target file, which will be on the phone. And in reverse, to pull a file, it is ADB pull. So here I do ADB pull and then the source is the phone and then the target is my computer. In practice, I've had a problem with pull, and it may be a bug in Ubuntu Touch. Before we go on, when you're trying to access files on Ubuntu Touch and reading files using Nano as your editor, and I happen to use Nano a lot, you will find that it doesn't work due to read-only permissions. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say I go to the root folder and type nano test. And you can see that it doesn't give me permissions to do that. So now I will show you how to temporarily undo the read-only permissions. And this may cause you to mess up the install, so just to warn you that if you screw things up, you may have to reinstall Ubuntu Touch on the phone. Now I've tried this command thinking that I need to have read-write rights on the system, and as it turns out, you really don't need this, but I'm going to tell you anyway in case you want to play with it. So this command will enable read-write on the phone system area. Type in sudo mount -o remount, RW, then /. And then to undo this, the command is sudo mount -o remount, RO, and then /. You should return it back to read only so it doesn't screw up the Ubports updates. Okay, next I want you to get familiar with the Ubuntu Touch file structure. It's a little different than a standard Linux distro. Now just to make this simple, I'm going to make myself root so I can see everything. So the command to be root is sudo su. Now in general, everything here is read-only except for the directory user data. So any setting you have or file or document will be in user data. This is not overwritten during a reinstall of Ubuntu Touch. So whatever you had set up before will always remain as long as you don't do a wipe of the user data area. And this includes programs that you installed yourself as well as data and settings. So let's look at what's in user data. It looks like this is where Ubuntu images are loaded to. So if there's an OTA update, over-the-air update, I presume it will be placed here. And it will replace the system.image file and the ubuntu.image file. You can see here that there are three different groups of writable areas. There's user data, there's system data, and then there's Android data. Now user data is simple. That's just where you find your documents, pictures, videos, music for each user. Here we have it for user phablet. System data is where any system setting handled by the OS is stored. So all your choices, system tweaks, app settings, apps, anything set by some program on the phone will be stored in this writable area. So as you can see, there really is normally no need to make the phone system area read-write. Ubuntu Touch is made so that all things that can be written to are separated in this system data area. There's another section here called Android data, and I presume this is where all the hardware and sensors have settings that the drivers can manipulate, also redirected to a writable area. Now, I would expect then that there wouldn't be an Android section on a Pinephone since it doesn't use Android drivers. So we'll remember to compare that when I get the Pinephone in a few days. I'll leave a correction in the description if this is different when I get the Pinephone. Now let's look at the way the rest of the file system is mapped. Normally the Linux kernel is in the boot folder. This is normally where you'd see what Linux kernel version is installed. But as you can see here, this directory is empty. I can check the current kernel version using this command, uname-a, and you can see that it appears to be some customized build with reference to 3.4 and CyanogenMod, which is an Android open source. Is this the 3.4 Linux kernel? Now, as it turns out, the way that Ubuntu Touch works is that it uses the kernel that comes with the original phone. So in this case, this is a Nexus 5, and it uses a compatible kernel that's compatible on a Nexus 5. So Ubports doesn't even change the kernel. It's whatever came with the Android on that particular phone. And when you get a Pinephone, it's going to have its own kernel, and that kernel is going to be loaded in before Ubuntu Touch. So on the Pinephone, it's expected to have a mainline kernel since the Pinephone is a mainline hardware. Most of the files related to the Ubuntu system seem to be here in System. This is mapped or symlinked to the Android system partition. If I look at System Boot, I see that there's an initial RAM image loaded off the OS called Android ramdisk.image. I don't know what step of the bootloading this is tied to, but obviously it's one of the earlier processes before init. Okay, let's search around some more. Normally on a typical Debian distro, the desktop icons are in user share applications. So let's investigate and look at that. And as you can see here, I recognize these applications as belonging only to the system applications, for example, like Dialer. The installed apps from the Open Store and their desktop icon settings are actually in the opt click.ubuntu.com directory. This is where the typical Open Store apps are stored, and they are called click packages. Now, how do these different apps and system programs manage to exist in a read-only file system? Let's look at the file system setup area. In Linux, this is in etc fstab. So let's look at that. You can see here that many of the settings usually found in etc or in varlib or in opt directories have been moved to user data and is defined here. So you can see the reference to the user data folder, and that's mapped from the original locations in etc, varlib, and opt. So any references to some writable area in some other folder is redirected to the writable user data directory. I imagine that this must have been a tedious thing to figure out and maintain, and I bet lots of bugs result from some value being stored accidentally in a read-only area. So for the most part, unless you're installing any apps and overwriting what is in Ubuntu Touch, you normally don't need to change Ubuntu Touch to ReadWrite, except maybe to use Nano. Everything that can be changed is kept in user data, which is read and writable. Let me show you something else interesting in this file system. Let's look at etc app to look at the sources list for the Ubuntu Touch. So this is what happens when you run apt-get install. As you can see here, if you try to use apt-get install and it's not one of the allowed programs on Ubports, apt-get will not work. You will see how many of the repositories are marked as restricted. The sources list is locked down. Now, this is not a limitation necessarily, since you can actually install in another area called a Libertine container, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And if we later look at the sources.list on that, you will find that it actually connects to the official Ubuntu repositories for Ubuntu 16.04. I'll show you how to do standard Debian installs to the Libertine container using apt or Debian packages in another video. A Libertine container, a term that Canonical came up with, is a root area. It's also using something called LXC, which is like a virtual machine. In that area, you're made to think you're in a root directory, so you can't get out of it. I'll show an example of where the Libertine container is stored. I happen to have set up a Libertine container, and the default name is called Xenial, and mine is found in the .cache, Libertine-Container, Xenial, root fs. You can see it's just a standard Ubuntu 16.04 root. For those of you with some understanding of Linux, a root is a jail directory inside the host Linux. And the jail folder is running Ubuntu 16.04 for desktop, as it's shown here. Since it's in a separate space on the drive, it doesn't disrupt or affect the Ubuntu Touch installation. Anyway, it was hard to figure it out, but I'll show you how I play with that in another video. In reality, there's a lot of limitations in this Libertine container, and it's mostly due to what parts of Ubuntu 16.04 are installed, and also issues relating to the display server, Mir. But in spite of that, I was able to install Wireshark on it, though obviously it is not usable due to the screen size. Also, for those wondering, the Libertine container has GTK support, so I was actually able to run a GTK version of Wireshark, which was interesting to know. Someone was kind enough to note to me that Ubuntu 16.04 had built-in GTK support. And by the way, I'm looking at the etc folder here, and I see that Python is installed all the way to Python 3.5. But unfortunately, you can't install any additional Python modules without changing the ReadWrite, so this must be here for system use. I wrote a program in Python and I can't install dependencies directly, at least on the main system area, so I'd have to do it in a Libertine container. Or maybe I'm not understanding the procedure clearly. Anyway, I'll be doing more videos on this to remove the mystery of Ubuntu Touch. Obviously, there's a lot I don't know. I haven't had the time to actually delve into the system source code, but at least I've looked at all the things that are similar to a standard Linux distro after the kernel is loaded. And from init on, it seems to be pretty standard. If you're an Ubuntu Touch expert and you'd like to add some more information, please feel free to do so in the comments below, and I'm happy to be corrected if I made a mistake in explaining things. And at least I'll be representative of an average Linux user trying to understand Ubuntu Touch. Please subscribe to my channel so you learn more about this series of videos, and make sure to hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching.